There are places on a map that seem tiny, almost insignificant. Hormuz is one of them. A strait between Iran and Oman, at the entrance to the Gulf, a narrow strip of water that connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, and then to the Indian Ocean. Said like that, nothing sounds spectacular. And yet, in 2025, nearly 20 million barrels per day pass through there. That represents about a quarter of the world's maritime oil trade. And that's not all. Nearly 1/5 of the world's liquefied natural gas trade also passes through there, mainly from Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. Today, as tensions around the Strait of Hormuz have once again escalated, with U.S.-Iranian talks announced and then disputed, transit restrictions, and an open crisis over navigation, the issue is no longer just regional. The central issue is much broader. How did the world become so dependent on such a narrow passage? The question isn't really whether Iran can hold the strait forever. That's probably not the issue. The real issue is that it doesn't need to keep it closed for long to cause a global shock. It's enough to disrupt, to intimidate, to raise the risk, to drive up insurance, to hold up shipping companies, to disrupt trade flows. In a tense world, that's already enough to shake up prices, logistics, and politics. What you first need to understand is the disproportion. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz is only about 54 kilometers wide, and ships don't have access to all of that space. The navigable channels are only about 2 nautical miles, or roughly 3.7 kilometers in each direction, separated by a buffer zone of about the same size. In other words, a significant part of the world economy passes through an extremely narrow corridor. That's why Hormuz is a choke point, a bottleneck. The term sounds technical, but it isn't. It simply means that a vital flow depends on a single passage, and that passage becomes a source of leverage. The modern world likes to talk about networks, fluidity, and globalization, but in the end, it still depends on a few gateways. Hormuz is one of the most important. And this is where the paradox appears. The more globalized exchanges become, the more certain points become strategic. Global fluidity doesn't eliminate bottlenecks, it makes them more valuable. So why does Iran matter so much here? Because in Hormuz, power isn't measured only by GDP or total naval tonnage. It's measured by geography. Iran is not the world's leading economic power. It's also not the world's leading navy. And yet, in this specific theater, it has a major advantage: proximity, coastal depth, terrain, the ability to threaten approaches to saturate the strait with asymmetric means. By playing on fear rather than conquest. That's what we're already seeing in the current crisis, where Tehran tightens its control, challenges freedom of passage, and uses Hormuz as leverage in its standoff with Washington. Let's be clear, Iran doesn't need to legally own the strait to have influence over it. Maritime law does provide for a principle of transit passage for international straits, even though neither Iran nor the United States has ratified the Montego Bay Convention. But in this kind of crisis, the law is only as good as its ability to be enforced. And when a passage becomes dangerous, it's less about the text and more about the real risk taken by ship owners, insurers, and states. The question isn't just who has the right. The question is, who can raise the cost of passage to the point where theoretical freedom becomes useless? That's exactly what has happened in recent weeks. Marine insurers have abruptly canceled or sharply increased certain war risk coverage. Shipping costs have soared, and dozens, then hundreds of ships have been blocked or rerouted. Again, what's at stake here isn't just military. It's also financial, legal, and psychological. The important point is that this strategy suits Iran perfectly. Why, you might ask? Because it allows them to play on a field where American superiority is less overwhelming than on the open sea or in a classic conventional war. In a narrow, crowded space close to the Iranian coast, the threat doesn't need to be permanent to be credible. A few incidents, a few interceptions, a few targeted strikes, a few days of uncertainty can be enough to produce a disproportionate effect. And that's precisely the Iranian logic at play. Not to defeat head-on the world's leading naval power, but to make the cost of freedom of navigation high enough that everyone is forced to recalculate. The goal is not just military. It is diplomatic, psychological, and economic. The classic mistake is to reduce the strait to just an oil choke point. Of course, oil is central. About 20 million barrels per day in 2025, which is a colossal volume for a single passage point. But the strait also concentrates a decisive share of the world's liquefied natural gas. In 2025, more than 110 billion cubic meters of LNG passed through it. About 93% of Qatar's LNG exports and 96% of those from the United Arab Emirates pass through it. And, crucially, there is no real alternative route for these volumes of gas. So when the strait is blocked, it's not just the oil markets that panic. It's also the gas, electricity, heavy industry, chemical, and fertilizer markets. The International Energy Agency also points out that more than 30% of global trade in urea, about 20% of ammonia and phosphate, as well as a significant share of aluminum and sulfur, also pass through this corridor. In other words, it also affects agriculture, metals, construction, and ultimately food prices. What you need to understand is that a shock to this corridor is never just a local shock, it's a ripple effect. The tanker doesn't arrive, there's a gas shortage, costs go up, states dip into their reserves, industries make tough choices, central banks hesitate, and governments provide subsidies. And very quickly, a geopolitical crisis turns into an economic crisis and then a social one. It's important to really convey how this mechanism works. When a strait like Hormuz becomes tense, it's not just traders or diplomats who react. Refineries start planning ahead. Industries review their purchases. Transporters raise their prices. And states fear the return of energy-driven inflation. And behind energy inflation, there's always the same chain. Rising production costs, higher prices, pressure on purchasing power, and political tension. In other words, a naval incident in the Gulf can end up affecting an electricity bill in Europe, the price of fertilizer in Asia, or transportation costs elsewhere in the world. That's why Hormuz goes far beyond just the Middle East. But this shock is not distributed equally, and that's where we see another hierarchy emerge, a much subtler one, that of regional dependencies. We often hear, if Hormuz closes, America will suffer. Well, yes, but not in the same way as others. The United States is still exposed to global prices, obviously, but their physical direct dependence on oil passing through Hormuz is much weaker than it used to be. In 2024, they imported only about 0.5 million barrels per day through this passage, which is 7% of their crude imports and 2% of their petroleum liquid consumption. That's very little compared to Asia. Asia, on the other hand, is the region most dependent on Hormuz. In 2024, about 84% of the crude oil and condensates passing through the strait were headed for Asian markets. In 2025, according to the IEA, 80% of the oil and petroleum product flows passing through Hormuz were destined for Asia, and China, along with India, alone received 44% of the crude exports passing through the strait. For LNG, the trend is even clearer. 90% of the gas exported via Hormuz was going to Asia. This means something very important. The closure of Hormuz is not just a Middle Eastern crisis. It's potentially an Asian crisis with global effects. And that's where the issue becomes geopolitical in the strongest sense. Because if Asia is the world's workshop and one of the main drivers of energy demand, then hitting Hormuz is indirectly hitting a central part of the global economy. In response to this, we might try to reassure ourselves and say, but what about alternative routes? Strategic reserves? That's true, in part. Saudi Arabia and the Emirates do have the ability to partially bypass Hormuz, but those capabilities remain limited. The IEA estimates the available rerouting capacity at between 3.5 and 5 million barrels per day. That's far from the 20 million barrels per day that passed through the strait in 2025. The US EIA, for its part, estimated about 2.6 million barrels per day as the spare capacity that could be mobilized from Saudi and Emirati infrastructure under certain conditions. In other words, we can cushion the blow, but not replace it. And for gas, the problem is even more severe. For the Qatari and Emirati volumes that pass through Hormuz, there is no serious land-based alternative capable of absorbing the shock. It's a very simple reality. For a portion of the world's LNG, Hormuz isn't just one route among others, it's the route. That's why the phrase "the world pays" is not an exaggeration. It's almost literal. Basically, Hormuz reminds us of a truth that many had forgotten. Globalization hasn't abolished geography, it has made it more ruthless. We have built an economic system that is presented as immense, complex, interconnected, and sophisticated. But this system still depends on a few straits, a few ports, a few pipelines, a few choke points. What is happening today in Hormuz is not just the confrontation between Tehran and Washington, nor even the future of the Gulf. What is at stake is the structural vulnerability of a world order that thought it was fluid and is now rediscovering that it still relies on bottlenecks. Maritime bottlenecks, energy bottlenecks, geographic bottlenecks. The question is no longer just whether Hormuz will be reopened tomorrow temporarily or under escort. The real question is much more unsettling. How much longer can the world pretend to be stable when a decisive share of its energy passes through such a narrow corridor, so vulnerable and so exposed to power struggles?